The C-SPAN networks bring you long-form public affairs programming from the nation's capital and are a public service of your television provider. C-SPAN, created by cable. This week on Q&A, author Tevi Troy discusses his new book titled What Jefferson Read, Ike Watched, and Obama Tweeted, 200 Years of Popular Culture in the White House.
Tevi Troy, where did you get the idea for your book on presidents and culture?
Well, I've worked in the White House, and I'm also a presidential historian. My first book was on intellectuals and the American presidency, and I'm curious about what shapes presidents. How do ideas get to the White House? And so I thought I'd look at how intellectuals worked first, and then I said that intellectuals actually didn't have that much impact, is one of the things I found. And so I decided to look at cultural influences. And now, thanks to the internet, there's so many ways to find out what presidents have watched, read, tweeted, and so I put it all together and made a book.
What was your most interesting finding as you dug into this?
Well, Woodrow Wilson was our only PhD president, and as a PhD I found that appealing, and so I was curious to see what he did as president. And he wasn't that big a reader as president, but he loved theater. He saw 250 plays as president, and his favorite genre was vaudeville. So he liked a good hook across the stage or a pie in the face as much as the next guy.
You know, we found out when Scott Berg was here that he also played 1,200 rounds of golf. Yep. What about the image? Did that create the same kind of image that today's golf would do?
Well, interesting with Wilson and his theater going, it was during World War I that the Washington Post editorialized in favor of Wilson going to the theater during wartime. You see in today's days, you see sometimes critical appraisals of the president when they play golf or go to the theater during wartime. But Wilson was praised because it helped keep the theatrical industry alive. So times have changed. I think that presidents should enjoy their leisure time. Obviously you shouldn't overindulge, but you worked very hard as president, and you should have a time to tune out or read something or think bigger thoughts.
We have a photograph, excuse me, from 1948. It's not in your book, but we found it, of the theater in the White House, the movie theater. That would have been during the Truman administration. And it's a black and white. It's changed dramatically since then. You see it over here on the screen. What's happened to that theater over the years?
Well, it started under Franklin Roosevelt. It's been refurbished a couple of times. From 1953 to 1986, there was a White House projectionist, a guy named Paul Fisher, who wrote down every movie that the president saw, and with one exception, who the president saw it with. The one exception is under Kennedy. Kennedy saw a movie. We don't know who he saw it with, which leads to all kinds of arch speculation. But it's a treasure trove of all the different movies presidents have seen at different times, and it gives us a window into what they were thinking about. So that movie theater's been around for a long time and has been very helpful to presidents in sometimes bringing people in, trying to encourage certain people, trying to get people along on a vote. So for example, George W. Bush brought in Ted Kennedy to see 13 Days, which was a movie about John F. Kennedy's experience with the Cuban Missile Crisis, and that made John F. Kennedy look pretty good. And so Bush, trying to be bipartisan, brought in Ted Kennedy, and they ended up working together on the successful No Child Left Behind law. They were able to get that passed with a bipartisan majority.
Go back to, who was the gentleman that kept the record?
His name was Paul Fisher, and there's some great stories about him. One story is that Eisenhower would not watch movies with Robert Mitchum in them because Robert Mitchum had been arrested for marijuana possession. And Fisher would try and sneak movies with Mitchum by Eisenhower. He'd tell him it's a certain movie, but he wouldn't tell him Mitchum was in it. But when Mitchum got on screen, Eisenhower would get up and walk out. Another great Fisher story is that when Jimmy Carter, who watched 480 movies as president, the most of any president, and he only did it in one term, when Jimmy Carter became president, he told Fisher that he wanted to watch family-friendly fare in the White House. And Fisher's reaction, think about it, this is the late 70s, was, you're not going to get to see many movies that way. And he was right.
So where did you find this information? Where does Mr. Fisher keep it?
Well, all of the Nixon movies are online, and you can look at every one that Nixon did. Some of the other ones aren't fully available, but you see different historians have
picked
them.
The movie itself is online?
No, the list of all the movies.
I'm sorry, okay.
So the list of all the movies, of all of Nixon's movies, are pretty easily accessible online. The rest require a lot of digging. There's actually a documentary on presidential movie watching that mentions a lot of this. And
well, go to that. See in your book you say that President Nixon watched 153 movies?
With B.B. Rebozo.
All of those?
So, Yeah, he loved Bibi Rebozo, which is his Cuban friend, and people said that Bibi Rebozo was the only kind of person that Nixon would relax around. He was always trying to impress everybody. When Robert Dallek has this great book on Nixon and Kissinger, where he makes the point that Nixon was always trying to be somebody else when he was with that person. So with Kissinger, he tried to be the great foreign policy strategist, or with Ehrlichman and Haldeman, he tried to be a political strategist. So he was always different people with different folks. But with Rebozo, he could be himself and just watch movies. On the website, or the WhiteHouseMuseum.org, they have several pictures on there, among a lot of other things. Most of them are White House pictures, like we saw on in the 1948 White House theater. But the theater has changed a great deal, and it's now, what, a very rich red? At least it was an all-white room. Right. How often do they use that room for things like, and I know you played some role in the Bush-Cheney debate preparation. How often do they use that room for that kind of thing? It is often used for that kind of stuff. It is the theaters are red plush seats, very comfortable. You can lean back in them. You don't need a projectionist anymore, because now you could just slip in a DVD and you've got Blu-ray, so that's a little different. The Ford administration, they used that room for debate prep, and in that room is where they had a disagreement about how to answer that question about the Soviet domination of Eastern Europe. And the answer that Ford gave that was so disastrous in that debate, which was there is no Soviet domination of Poland and of Eastern Europe, was an answer he was actually prepped with in that room at the White House Theater. But it's more often used, I would say, for entertainment for the president, his family, and his friends and guests. The Obamas used it to entertain the girls a lot, and girls bring in friends to watch movies. How were you involved in the Bush-Cheney debate preparation? I did the debate prep books, which was a very difficult and arduous job. You had to have these 2 debate prep books that covered every subject. So the person who had done it before me, I said to him on the first day, I was asking him for advice, and I said, there must be 4,000 possible questions. How do you possibly do this? And he said, you're right, there's 4,000 possible questions, but there's only 40 answers. It's your job to write those 40 answers. And you had to write those answers in the fields of economics, domestic policy, homeland security, and national security policy. And you had to make sure that the president's book and the vice president's book were exactly the same, and that every time there was a new economic number or a new development or a new vote in Congress, you had to keep all that up to date, and you had to keep it punchy. So it was a challenging task. What elections did you work on? I worked on the 2004 election. I was full-time on that, but I've given advice and written about debates subsequently. And over the years, have you studied the history of debates? And what can you tell us about what were some of the more interesting anecdotes from debate prep? Yeah, and I have some of them in the book, actually, because the debates are very important on TV. And so the most famous story about the debate and TV is the 1960 election. John F. Kennedy is going up against Richard Nixon. Nixon was kind of confident about his use of TV because of the 1952 Checkers speech. This was the speech where Nixon salvaged his political career by going on TV and talking about his dog Checkers and how he wasn't going to give it up, and he managed to get out of allegations of financial impropriety by giving that Checkers speech. So he was confident about his use of TV. Eisenhower, however, was a little more skeptical and advised Nixon not to do the debate on TV with Kennedy. Nixon obviously didn't listen, but he also didn't do a lot of prep. He didn't wear makeup. He was not tired. He was not shaved, and he looked bad on screen. In fact, Eisenhower watched the debate with Harold Macmillan, who was the British Prime Minister, and Macmillan said that your guy looks like some kind of ex-con, whereas the other guy looks like a sprightly undergraduate. So Kennedy defeated him on TV, even though people on the radio thought that Nixon had done better. Before we leave John F. Kennedy, you say in your book that he watched 48 movies. What were his type of movies that he watched? Well, there was this famous thing that he liked James Bond. So he saw the movie From Russia with Love, but he wasn't really a big movie watcher. He was kind of impatient. He didn't like to sit still for very long. He liked talking to people. He really liked engaging with people, and so he's not one of the big presidential movie watchers. D.W. Griffith, you mentioned him early in the book about and Woodrow Wilson. What's that story? So D.W. Griffith was the director of the film Birth of a Nation, which is a racist film that has a terrible depiction of black people and a very pro-Confederate view of things. And Wilson watched it in the White House not because he was such a fan of the film or wanted to promote the film. We didn't even have this concept. It was the first film watched in the White House. But his wife had died, and he didn't think it was appropriate for him to be seen going out to a movie. So he had a college connection to Griffith, and he agreed to see the movie in the White House, which became framed as a White House screening. And then there's this famous line about Wilson seeing the movie. He said supposedly that it was like history written by lightning. And I argue in the book that that is the most famous movie review in history, but the truth is he probably never said it.
Speaking of movies, we have some home movies from the Lyndon Johnson years. Most of this is down on the ranch, and we'll roll it and let you see if you recognize anybody in these movies. There is LBJ and Hubert Humphrey, and you see the dog. How often do presidents use dogs?
Very often. Presidential pets are a big deal. People love the pets on the website, and they weigh in about the pets. You've had, for example, Bush had an annual movie with Barney, his dog.
That's Mrs. Humphrey, by the way, who turned out to be a senator, and there's Mrs.
Right.
Johnson. Go ahead with it. We're going to see the dog again.
So Johnson famously had that image where he held the dog up by the ears, and people thought it was cruelty to animals. And of course, Johnson was, I think, just as cruel to the people that he dealt with his famous treatment where he'd get in your face and kind of push you.
Now, this was 1955 when this was shot. Home movies again. What do you think of this kind of thing if the public had seen this when he ran?
Well, the shirtless picture kind of reminds me of the shirtless picture of Vladimir Putin of a few years ago. I don't think people want to see shirtless pictures of the president or candidates. You did have that experience, though, where Johnson at one point lifted up his shirt and showed his appendicitis scar, and there was a big tumult about that. So obviously, sometimes you have a president go to the beach, like you've seen Obama on the beach or Clinton on the beach. But for the most part, I think presidents should keep their clothes on.
What do you think of the idea of taking these home movies and then eventually releasing them? The Richard Nixon's became public. There were home movies of John F. Kennedy and others. Did you look at that for your book?
A little bit, but the point about the home movies is similar to the larger point I'm making about pop culture. Pop culture is important for presidents to humanize themselves, to show that they are regular guys, to show that you can have an appeal with them, even though they're this big guy and they go on the podium and they're very important and they have a lot of power, but you can relate to them. You take home movies just like they do. You watch I Love Lucy just like they do. So I think home movies and pop culture really help the American presidents relate to the common man. And I think that's one of the points.
I'm sorry, I thought you meant who did not like movies and who did not watch movies?
Harry Truman. No interest in movies. In fact, I write in the book that he had a vacation home in Florida, and he would go to this home in Florida and he would show movies to the guests, but he wasn't much interested in them. He liked reading. He was a huge fan of reading. He's our last president not to be a college graduate, but he was an autodidact, read history all the time. He said, in fact, the only thing new in this world is the history that you haven't read yet. And he often brought up history that he was reading in his meetings, national security meetings, and other places. And to the extent that there's been a Truman resurgence in the last couple of years, so that Truman's reputation has increased, a lot of the biographers, like McCollum, focus on Truman's reading and to show how up to date he was.
So when did you start your history interests?
Well, my dad was a history teacher in the New York City public schools. My brother is a presidential historian at McGill University. And so I was always reading history as a kid and loved history from a very young age. But I also had a political bug, so I got a PhD, but I was doing it not necessarily to teach, but I wanted to get involved in politics, and that's what I did. So I've had these two interests in both politics and history, and I've combined them.
Where did you get your PhD?
I got my PhD from the University of Texas at Austin, so we had those LBJ pictures. I took a lot of classes at the LBJ school, and Elspeth Rostow, who is now unfortunately passed on, but she was the expert on the presidency, and I took a bunch of classes with her, and I did my oral exams, my readings with her, and she was one of my dissertation advisors, and I learned a ton from her. And obviously she is the wife of Walt Rostow, who is National Security Advisor under Lyndon Johnson.
When you started studying history, did you have a political view? And if so, what was it?
Well, I grew up in New York City in the 1970s, and I grew up in a liberal Jewish neighborhood, and it was a liberal Jewish household. But I also saw in the 1970s that things weren't really working. And I saw there was graffiti and blackouts and all kinds of troubles in the streets of New York, and I thought that perhaps there had to be a better way. And so I was very admiring of Ronald Reagan, how he helped turn things around in the country, but I was also admiring of Giuliani and how he helped turn things around in the city. So I think my reading helped me become more on the conservative side.
Ronald Reagan came from the movies, but what was his habit when he was in the White House for those 2 terms?
Yeah, well, I mentioned Paul Fisher before, the White House projectionist. Ronald Reagan told Fisher that the golden oldies are the ones for me. He didn't like current movies as much. He watched some, and sometimes he referred to them. So he referred to Rambo once after a hostage crisis and said, "I've seen Rambo last night, and now I know what to do next time there's a hostage crisis." It was a joking thing, but it was still a movie reference. But he liked to sit at home in the White House residence with Nancy. They would put on their pajamas pretty early in the evening if they didn't have a social obligation, and he would read. He read policy memos and a lot of books, more books than people think, but he also liked to watch TV. He liked Murder, She Wrote, and there were even some jokes from the late night comedians about him liking Murder, She Wrote. Jay Leno once said that after he had to be woken up for a national security event, he said now the new policy is that he can only be woken up for a national emergency and Murder, She Wrote. And then he also liked watching the Sunday shows. He really liked Meet the Press, Face the Nation, and watched them pretty carefully.
How do you find this stuff?
Well, the internet is a great tool. I did a lot of searching from the internet. Google Books helped me search through indexes so I could find the books that I needed. I looked at a lot of the presidential archives are now online. The Library of Congress has a wonderful collection. I have a collection in my home of biographies of every president, at least one. And so you start from there and then you just branch out.
When did you last work in politics, and what are you doing now?
I was the Deputy Secretary of Health and Human Services until early 2009, so the end of the Bush administration. I left there to go to the Hudson Institute, and I've been at Hudson Institute studying politics, pop culture, the presidency, and healthcare since 2009. So I write a lot of articles, I do some TV stuff, and I also wrote this book.
I want to show you some video of Richard Nixon when he was here for a book notes interview back in the 90s. I'm looking it up here to make sure I got the right date. It was 92, right before he passed on fairly soon after that. But here he is talking about books and his life.
You would have to take the Bible for that. I mean, the Bible, apart from religion, is great literature. The New Testament particularly, and even parts of the Old Testament. I've always felt that the book of Ecclesiastes, for example, was some of the most eloquent writing that I've ever seen, and it always lifts you. So I would pick that as a book. Now, among others, very hard to tell. Among current authors that I read who write historically, I would say the books by Paul Johnson appeal to me a great deal. He's a marvelous writer. He's a geopolitical thinker. And many people, of course, remember his later books, but the one that is my favorite is his one on the British, The Offshore Islanders. It's just a marvelous book. It's not only great prose, it's great poetry as well.
What did you find out about Bible reading on the part of presidents?
I'm so glad you asked. I have a lot in there about the Bible. The Bible has been very important to many of our founders and many of our presidents. James Madison studied Hebrew so that he could understand the Bible better, so that he can understand the political context of what was going on with the Israelite leaders. Lincoln had very few books as a kid, but he read them all, and he read them over and over again, and one of the books he read was the Bible, and he really internalized it, and you could see in his speeches. The most famous example is 77 years ago, which is a biblical type of language. He used the Bible to appeal to Americans and to use a language that they understood, and people were much more Bible literate in those days. But a great story I have in the book is about Gerald Ford going on Air Force One at one point and asking for a Bible, and he was told that there was no Bible on Air Force One. And so he said there should be, and there was subsequently after his request, but since then there's always been a Bible on Air Force One because of Gerald Ford's request.
And you say also that Gerald Ford told Bob Novak at one point that he had read The Twilight of the Presidency by George Reedy. What was the significance of that?
Well, Reedy talked about the weakness of the presidency at that time and so some of the previous overextensions. And Ford took from that book that not that presidential power should be expanded, which other previous presidents had tried to do, including Nixon, including Johnson. And he thought maybe he should have a more modest approach to the presidency. And so Novak was really struck by Ford, who at that point was not yet president, but it was pretty clear that as vice president with Nixon close to resigning that he was going to be president. He was struck by Ford's more modest approach and his willingness to shrink the power of the presidency rather than expand it.
Richard Nixon mentioned Paul Johnson, who wrote a book called The History of the United States.
Yeah, good book.
And then there's a book called People's History of the United States by Howard Zinn.
Very different.
If you were to read one and not the other, what would you get?
Absolutely Paul Johnson. I mean, Paul Johnson is...
Well, I'm not so sure. I want to start with what's the difference, first of all. What would a student, if they were given only one side of that book, what would they get? from either Paul Johnson or Howard Zinn?
Well, they both have ideological predispositions. Zinn is Marxist and Johnson is more conservative. But Johnson is a very careful footnoter. I just read this fascinating article about Johnson's way of doing research. He writes with a typewriter, but he has two typewriters going at all times. One is the typewriter of the text that he's writing. The other is the footnote typewriter, because in the days before computers, it wasn't so easy to link the two. And I'm not sure I could have done all my footnoting without a computer, but Paul Johnson has this method. So he's very careful user of sources and making sure that he's got everything right. Or I think Zinn sometimes let his ideology get the better of his scholarship.
We've got some video of Jimmy Carter, who was here in about 1995, and he's talking about his book of poetry.
Beginning about 5 years ago, I studied textbooks about poetry and the different kinds of poetry, the different kinds of meter, and whether they rhymed or not, open verse and so forth, and also poetry books that analyzed what famous poets were saying and how they said it and the words they chose. My favorite poet of all times is Dylan Thomas, but I don't have any ability or inclination to try to emulate his poetry.
What did you think of Jimmy Carter has written a lot of books. What did you find out about him in books?
Yeah, Jimmy Carter's written 23 books, which is more than any other ex-president or president in their lifetimes. Theodore Roosevelt wrote a lot of books I talk about, but most of them were before he became president. Jimmy Carter's book library has developed since he's become president. He mentions the Bible a lot in his books. He mentions his growing up in Georgia. And he's done very well, been very successful with his book sales. And it's part of his kind of shaping himself as people always call him the best ex-president. I'm not sure I agree with the conceptualization, but it is part of his resurgence in his post-presidential years that he's become this contemplative author.
What kind of an author do you think he is? Have you read much of his?
I've read some of his stuff. It's very autobiographical. It's a lot kind of homespun stuff. I've heard that he has a lot of church-going ladies in the South seem to like it, and they buy a lot of his books. So he's kind of got this this built-in audience that works pretty well for him.
What do you think of the story that has run for years that Teddy Roosevelt read a book a day or more? And is that really possible?
Yeah, sometimes 2 or 3, and I know it's possible because when I was in graduate school, I had to read multiple books a day in order to prepare for the orals. But
From
Teddy
start
Roosevelt,
to finish?
Yeah, but Teddy Roosevelt was also president, so he was a very fast reader. I would have to suspect, and I'm not sure on this, but that books in this, when printing was more expensive, books were probably a little shorter, but still 2 to 3 books a day is impressive. He was a very fast reader. He only had one good eye, but he really could scan through books very quickly, and books really helped shape ideas in his head, help shape policy. He used to reach out to authors if he liked their books and develop relationships with them. And then often there's the famous example of Upton Sinclair's The Jungle, which talked about the horrible conditions in the U.S. meatpacking plants that led to the creation of the FDA under Roosevelt.
What are some of the books that were important in the early years with the founding group in this country?
Yeah, well, the founding fathers read a lot of the classics. They liked reading Greek and Roman works. They read history. They read philosophy. But it was really, I talk about this in the book, that the classics really appealed to them. They liked to read Cicero and Cato. George Washington showed Addison's play Cato to the troops at Valley Forge to encourage them during the demoralizing winter of 1777-78 at Valley Forge, when it was kind of cold and things weren't going well on the war front. Adams loved Cicero, and we would reread one of his books annually. Jefferson was a wide-ranging reader who read all kinds of law, history, philosophy, and in fact, James Madison, when he was preparing to come up with the Constitutional Convention and eventually write the Constitution, he asked Jefferson for recommendations of books he should read. And Jefferson, at a time when books were very expensive, sent him 2 cratefuls of books that Madison wrote a memo on, and he used that memo to inform his thoughts about the Constitution. When did
the presidents stop reading the classics, or is there such a thing as a time when they stopped reading the classics?
Well, I think first of all, there are just so many more books available today, and some books, if you were reading Adam Smith's Wealth of Nations in 1776, it wasn't a classic then, it was a new book, and it was kind of cutting edge. So some books become classics over time. But I think now there's sort of a presumption that the classics you read as a kid, and when you're an adult you want to keep up and read some of the latest biographies. George W. Bush, for example, was a huge reader, but he read mostly current and new histories and biographies. He read 14 different Lincoln biographies while he was president. So there's so many new books out, it's hard to keep up.
Did you ever talk to him when you worked for the administration about books?
Sure. I sat in. I was privileged to sit in with him with a couple of meetings he had with historians where he talked about books. I know Donald Kennedy from Stanford was at one of those meetings, and he's not necessarily the biggest fan of the president, but he was impressed with Bush's knowledge of books and how many books he read.
Was there a president that didn't read at all that you found?
Lyndon Johnson didn't seem to read very much. I haven't found any president who read no books, but Johnson didn't seem to read that much. Woodrow Wilson has said, even though he's a PhD president, as president he didn't read that much, although he liked to read mysteries, but he didn't read serious nonfiction to a great extent as president. George H.W. Bush, there's a great story I tell in the book when he's at Kennebunkport, and he's asked by reporters what he's doing on his summer vacation at Kennebunkport, and he said, well, I'm going to do some tennis, some golf, some motorboating, some running, some horseshoes, and I'll do a little reading. I throw that out for the intellectuals out there. So reading wasn't his top priority either.
Over the years, when you look back at the books that had an impact on a president, what did you find?
Well, that was actually,
and then subsequently an impact on us as people.
Right. That's actually one of my inspirations for writing this book. I was curious to see whether books had an impact. And one of the most famous stories of this is Michael Harrington wrote a book called The Other America in the early 1960s. It was about poverty, especially in West Virginia. Kennedy is supposed to have read that book, and it led to the war on poverty. It's not quite that simple. It didn't happen quite that way. What he read was a book review by Dwight MacDonald in the New Yorker, which is one of the most famous New Yorker articles ever, in part because of Kennedy's reading of it. And that inspired Kennedy to tell Walter Heller, who was his chairman of the Council of Economic Advisors, to go look into policies that could be used to alleviate poverty. And Kennedy tragically died, obviously, in November '63, but Johnson then heard about this program and he said, that's my kind of program, and he pursued it as president.
Were there other books back years ago that you found that had an impact on the discussion in the country?
Yeah, well, I mentioned The Jungle with Teddy Roosevelt. I also found Thomas Paine's Common Sense was well read by the founders. This was before anyone was a president. We were still trying to rebel against England, but that book was very important, more pamphlet really, but it was very important in helping buck up morale against the British when in a tough time in the Revolutionary period. And it was a huge bestseller. In fact, I say that adjusted for population, the sales of that book were equivalent to the sales of Peyton Place, which was a big bestseller in the 1950s.
So what impact did democracy in America have on the 1800s? Any in this country?
Well, it has helped shape historians and sociologists' view of America. I did not find any impact that it had on our presidents, but I'm sure you have a lot of C-SPAN listeners who follow this stuff, and I'm curious to hear if somebody knows something that I didn't find on it.
What about the Federalist Papers? How much impact? I know they had an impact when they passed the Constitution, but beyond that, how much impact do you see the Federalist Papers having?
Well, I think
you studied the law.
Yeah, they clearly inform the debate. People often refer back to them. Again, I remember. I don't remember any instances where a president said, well, I've been reading the Federalist Papers, and this is part of what I was talking about with once the classics become classics, you don't refer to reading them as frequently, but it obviously helped shape the debate over the Constitution, and James Madison, one of our future presidents at the time, was heavily involved in that.
Now, you say you're a presidential historian, and we know because we had our correspondent at your book party here in town, and we have a picture of something and someone that was there at this party. We'll show it on the screen. It's a former president, and people may not recognize him right away, but it's Thomas Jefferson. And Thomas Jefferson, Thomas Jefferson is one of the mascots for the Washington Nationals baseball team. Question to you, how expensive it is to have this guy come to your party?
To be honest, I don't know, because very kind people paid for the party, and so I'm grateful to them. But I do know that Thomas Jefferson is cheaper than Teddy Roosevelt, who's the guy who always loses the races. So that's one of the reasons we chose him. The other reason is because he's obviously in the title, What Jefferson Read, Ike Watched, and Obama Tweeted.
Well, you know, you talk about culture, though. The Washington Nationals have this race at every game here, home games here, with Teddy Roosevelt, Abraham Lincoln, George Washington, Thomas Jefferson, and they added William Howard Taft to it. What impact do you think that has on people's interest, if any, on history?
I think it's a huge impact, and I really like the way the Nationals have kind of embraced the history of Washington and made it part of their story. So I think anything you can do to get young people interested in studying the presidency, which is a fascinating field, is a good thing. And that's one of the reasons I use so much pop culture in this book. It's sort of an avenue to the minds of young people.
How long did it take you to do this book?
I've been thinking about these issues for years. The actual writing, once I got the book contract, was about a full year, and then about 8 months in terms of editing and footnotes and adjustments.
Who's your audience?
Anyone who's interested in the presidency, anyone who's interested in pop culture, so the Venn diagram on there has some significant overlap, but Americans who are interested in how policy gets made and how ideas are shaped in America. I think it's a pretty broad audience.
Here's another example of a modern president talking about books and his favorite book and favorite author. It's Bill Clinton.
In my adult life, I think the finest novel I've read is Gabriel Garcia Marquez's 100 Years of Solitude. I read it when I was in law school, and I've gone back to it 2 or 3 times since then. It's a rhapsodic, mystical, marvelous work, and I enjoyed that very, very much. And as I said, a lot of the fiction I read now is more for release. I read a lot of mysteries and thrillers. Well, yeah, I just read a mystery by Gerald Seymour, a British writer, about Bosnia and Croatia. I just read an interesting book by Thomas Gifford, who's a great mystery writer, called Saints Rest, and a kind of a fun read called Jack and Jill by a mystery writer named Patterson.
In your book, on page 206, you have a whole list of the full list of Bill Clinton's favorite books. Where'd you find that?
It's on the internet. Clinton printed it out. He published it at one point. But if you look at his memoir, it's just filled with references to books he read at different times in his life. There's one time when he went into Russia, that famous trip to Russia, and he said that the Soviet border guards kind of went through, rifling through his bags, thinking that they might find pornography, but instead they found Russian novelists in there. So he was a huge reader, constantly reading it and constantly talking about it, and he put together this book list.
Well, as you know, in David McCullough's book on Harry Truman, he talks about his last 20 years. He went home and sat in his, I don't know if it was a den or not, I've seen it, and sat there and read all the time. I remember I went to see that home, and they asked me if I'd like to see a list of all the books, and they gave me a list of the 2,000 books that are still in that house. Where did Harry Truman get this? As you said, he was the last guy to be president who did not have a college degree.
Well, he loved reading as a child. His mother encouraged the habit. In fact, he became very engrossed as a reader. His daughter, Margaret Truman, said that they could be having an argument or the world could be coming to an end, and Harry Truman wouldn't look up until he got to the bottom of the page. He says, and I talk about this in the book, that he spent something like $5 on a set of Mark Twain books at a time when that was a lot of money, and he really read the Twain books and loved them a great deal. But I also wonder if that point about him not going to college made him feel like he had to read in order to keep up with all the, the brainy Harvard Yale types who were in Washington.
Did you come across any president that started reading on his own rather than having a family that read?
Yeah, Lincoln, clearly. I mean, Lincoln did not have huge family influences influencing his reading. In fact, his father criticized him for his reading and thought it was a bit of a waste of time. So Lincoln, he really came to it in himself, and it shaped him and helped him come up from his poor hardscrabble upbringings, and really is the one story of a president who really came from obscurity to become the president by virtue of his reading.
We also know that he read a lot of Shakespeare, or at least he started reading Shakespeare. Would you find that among presidents today?
Not as much. I found it much more in the 19th century. I talk about John Tyler and how he loved Shakespeare and would make Shakespearean allusions. At the time, people were much more attuned to that sort of thing, and they understood the references. Now, I think you might have a president who might go to Shakespeare's plays, but I don't know any who read Shakespeare on a regular basis.
As you know, near the end of George W. Bush's presidency, Karl Rove wanted to prove that he was a reader, and I think I remember seeing one article in the Wall Street Journal where he read how many books didn't they have a contest?
They did have a contest. They would read something like 80 to 90 books a year, and they were very serious about it. They're both competitive guys, and they would track the number of pages they read. So it's not just I read a book, but I read one book that's 500 pages and he read a book that was 200 pages. They would track pages to keep up with the number of books and the number of pages. But this is an important point because there was this sense of Bush as a non-reader in 2000, and it's just not borne out factually. I quote a journalist in there who said that Bush is a graduate of Harvard and Yale who does not read books. And that's a factually inaccurate statement. I think it's journalistic malpractice. You can't just go around and say things that are not true. That was verifiable, and I think the journalist should have verified it. Then once Bush became president and it became clear and obvious to everyone that he did read a lot of books, there was some people kind of sniffed at it and said, well, he has a narrow reading list, or he uses reading to advance certain preconceptions of his. But what I found is that Bush was much more likely to read a book by a liberal author than either Obama or Clinton were to be reading books by conservative authors.
Here he is near the end of his presidency talking about reading books on this network.
I spend a lot of time reading. If the question is, do you find ways to kind of escape from your job? Can you possibly leave the presidency living in the White House? And the answer to that is the only way I have found to do that is either through vigorous exercise or reading. And books allow you to escape. Books can put your mind in another location. And so I've been reading a lot since I've been the president. And this is a great place to read. It's quiet. There's not a lot of action here. And there's nice, comfortable chairs with good lighting.
What's your sense of where presidents read and when they read?
Well, they read in the evenings. That's clear. They read in the residence, which is pretty quiet. Bush was interviewed post-presidentially about his reading, and the interviewer, Peter Robinson from Hoover Institution, asked him, what books are on your nightstand? And Bush kind of mocked him a little bit and said, nightstand, I have an iPad, please. So I think now presidents might be more apt to read electronic books on the Kindle or on the iPad. But historically, it's been in the residence and in a nice, quiet place.
You do a lot of boxes in your book with little interesting facts. You have a whole page that's boxed in about the Jewish people that give presidents Jewish books. Explain that one.
Yeah, I thought that was a little bizarre that you had Netanyahu gave Obama a book of the Book of Esther, and then you had Jeffrey Goldberg give a Haggadah, which is the Passover Seder book, to Obama. And then
he's a journalist.
He's a journalist. And then you had Peter Beinart give his book, 2 copies of his book, to the president, one to the National Security Advisor. And there's nothing wrong with it, and obviously there's a lot of Jewish authors out there, and I am one myself. But it just seemed a little funny to me that you had all these authors, at least in the first 2 cases, giving Jewish religious books to a non-Jewish president. And I would wonder what would happen if there had been a Jewish president and he were given a bunch of Christian books. Would people think that was weird? Would people in the Jewish community think it was a little odd? So I just highlighted that. A couple of people have criticized me on that. And they don't think that it's an apt comparison or that there's anything wrong with it. And I'm not saying there's anything wrong with it, but I did think it raised an eyebrow.
You grew up in New York City. What were your parents like? Are they still alive, by the way, and what do they do?
They are, thank God. My parents are both retired now. My dad was a New York City public school history teacher, and my mom was a guidance counselor in the New York City public school systems. And reading was always big in the family. My dad would sit in his chair or in his bed and read, and my mom liked to read a lot of mystery novels. And my brothers were both much older, and they left the house once I really reached serious reading age. And so I was on my own a lot, and I liked to read.
So can you remember the earliest books that you read? I don't mean one when you were 5 years old, but when you started getting serious about history that had an impact on you?
Well, I think I'd probably want to go to my early 20s, and there are a couple of books that had a real impact on me. One was The Closing of the American Mind by Alan Bloom, and that talked about the impact of culture. And I think that has informed a lot of my thinking about culture ever since. Another book that is just a wonderful book is called Common Ground by J. Anthony Lukács. I don't know if you've ever read that one, but it talks about busing in Boston. But I remember reading one of the blurbs to say that this book is about busing in Boston is like saying Moby Dick is about whaling in New Bedford. It's about so much more. And it's about the impact of policy on people's lives and the unintended consequences of certain policies. So those books had a pretty significant impact on me at a young age.
How fast do you read?
I could read pretty fast. The Jewish New Year, I keep track of how many books I read by the Jewish New Year, and within the first 3 days of the year, I had read 3 books. So I was on a 360 book a year pace. I'm not going to keep that up, but that's what I started with.
How often do you not finish a book?
It's rare. When I start a book, I like to finish it. There are some books like the Caro books on Johnson that I don't read in one sitting because they're just too long, but I read them a little bit at a time, and I'm almost up to book 3 of the 4 books.
What do you think of them?
They're unbelievably fascinating. I mean, Caro has a different writing style, and I'm not sure that most historians take that approach. He's unique, but he really gets into the heart and soul of Lyndon Johnson in a way that I think Johnson would be pretty uncomfortable with. I mean, he kind of defines Johnson from the inside out, and it's almost harrowing to read.
What other current historians do you like?
Well, David McCulloch's books on Adams and Truman have been wonderful. They read like novels from my perspective. I really like Victor Davis Hanson and his books on Carnage and Culture and Western Way of War. I mean, he has written about the Western ideas and how they have helped the West in battles against non-Western nations. And you might think it's just about the technology, but it's not. He's talking about the Western banking system or Western ideas of kind of free communication of ideas and how that has helped win certain battles. So I really like those historians.
You have a chapter, Obama, full-fledged product of American pop culture.
Yes.
First question, though, on that is, what impact did his book, Dreams of Our Father, have on his run for the presidency?
Oh, I think a tremendous impact. I read it and I was very impressed with how lyrical it was, how well written it was, what a compelling story it was. And even now, when you've heard some of the stuff from David Marinis and others about how there are certain facts that he shaded over, it still really gives you a window into the guy's soul, and tells you why he's a successful politician. But he does have a section in there that I cite in the book where he talks about how much TV he watched as a kid, and it really kind of blew me away that he was going to this elite school of Punahou in Hawaii, and he pretty much says that after school he went to the comic book store, then he watched cartoons, then he watched sitcom reruns, then he watched primetime TV with his grandfather, and then he listened to top 40 music on the FM radio until he went to sleep. And that really struck me as, that's a really pop culture suffused childhood. Now, I write in the book that he did shake off couch potato dumb and read books more when he got older, and without which he never would have become president. But there was definitely that early impact of TV and pop culture on him.
We know about at least 2 meetings that he had with a group of historians. Did you find anything else about the number of times that he has met with people that, books that he may have read?
Well, there was a fair bit about his reading. He used to have this habit of he'd go up to Martha's Vineyard and he'd go to the store Bunch of Grapes. And when he'd go there, he'd pick a book and it got leaked out and everybody would dissect what book he read and what it means. One book in particular, he read Jonathan Franzen's book Freedom, and he got it before the book was actually commercially available. And that started off this whole wave of interest throughout the publishing industry and throughout. It became a big bestseller, not just because of Obama's interest, but Obama's interest certainly helped spur it on. But the last 2 summers, he's stopped doing that, and he hasn't made his book selections quite as public. You
have another one of your boxes in the Obama chapter, and it says, Obama's preferred shows are dark and edgy, decidedly not family fare, so he usually watches them alone. The First Lady seems to have no interest in his gritty favorites. Her taste and her daughter's run to Modern Family. At a fundraiser with Modern Family's Jesse Tyler Ferguson in 2011, the president assured everyone that Michelle and the girls love them. Some Modern Family. They love that show. I guess, what did you learn about his current habits besides what you just wrote here?
Well, he really does like TV. He watches a lot of ESPN. In fact, there was a fascinating Politico piece that suggested that certain political actors in Washington were buying advertising on ESPN with the hopes that they can get Obama with all of his ESPN watching. But he does seem to like the shows. I said they're kind of gritty and edgy. There's this new wave, this sort of third golden age of TV, where you've got some very impressive shows on the air, like The Wire, like Homeland, like Boardwalk Empire. And Obama seems to gravitate towards those shows. I say that many of these shows are on pay cable, and I joke in the book that he seems to like the shows of the 1% rather than those of the 99%.
What about his theater habits? We had a photograph on the screen earlier of him with 3D glasses on. How often do you find him in that theater?
He likes movies. He like many middle-aged males, which I include myself, TV seems to have a lot more appeal these days because of these edgy shows. But he watches movies and talks about them, and then sometimes jokes about them. So he's kind of aware of what's going on in movies, but doesn't seem quite as obsessed with movies as, let's say, a Jimmy Carter.
So when you go to his opponents and you relate his opponents during the campaigns to the culture thing, how did he trump them?
Yeah, well, Mitt Romney, whom I was a supporter, would refer to pop culture, but the pop culture he referred to, and I mentioned this in the book, he talked about Seinfeld, he talked about Ferris Bueller's Day Off. Now, if you think about it, those are perfectly acceptable references, but they're 2 to 3 decades old. So they're not really cutting-edge references. Obama was much more up-to-date in his references, much more aware, and much more able to reach out to the youth. I talk about how he slow-jammed the news with Jimmy Fallon, which many Americans, and certainly Mitt Romney, probably never heard of this concept of slow-jamming the news. But Obama was very good and very talented at using pop culture and using pop culture outlets to appeal to the voters that he wanted to come out to vote for him.
What do you think he's done in running for the presidency that has changed the way people might do it in the future?
I think he understands the segmentation of the audience, the way that TV executives now understand it. When I was growing up, you watched Happy Days, and seemingly everybody watched it, and the numbers of people watching Happy Days were staggeringly high. Today, even the shows that people are talking about aren't really watched by that many people. In fact, the vast majority of Americans have never seen even the most popular shows. So Obama understood the need to appeal to audience by segmentation and appealing to them in their areas of interest. So I think other presidents will have to be more savvy about doing that. I also think that there's kind of the sense that Republicans have been old white guys and not really up to date with the culture, and there's been a lot of talk, including in the famous Republican National Committee autopsy about the 2012 election, that they have to be a little bit more up to date on pop culture. And some of the Republicans who are thinking of running in 2016 are these kind of younger 40-ish males who express interest in either TV or movies or rap music or hard rock music.
So far in your talking about your book, what have you found people the most interested in?
People are just amazed that this stuff has been going on for a long time. They asked me, like you did, how long it took to write it and how you found all this information. I think that's the most frequent question. How did you find this? And especially in recent presidents, I have to give a shout out to Politico, which really covers very carefully what the presidents are reading and watching. And so some of the stuff on Obama I never could have written without that source.
You have an interesting quote near the end of your book. The pervasiveness of American popular culture, says Michael Hogan. Who's Michael Hogan?
He's an author and historian, studied cultural issues.
The pervasiveness of American popular culture, of blue jeans and basketball, of jazz music and rock and roll, of Hollywood movies and television represented one of the most important cultural developments of the 20th century. Explain why you used
that quote really jumped out at me. It was something that I happen to believe, but it's always good to have that third-party validation. But what Hogan is saying is that American culture really captured the world in a way that the world hadn't been captured by a single culture ever. So you hear stories about people. Peter Berger used to tell the story of he would was a sociologist, would go to Africa and he was bald, and people would say to him in the 1970s, "Hey, Kojak." And so American cultural ideas and tropes and symbols have really reached everywhere in the world, and they're one of the few common touchstones throughout the world. And so whether it's blue jeans or rock music or American movies, that is how people across the world in many areas, and almost all areas, can communicate to some degree in a way that they weren't able to in the past.
We haven't talked much about radio. We've talked about television. We've talked about movies. Over the years, and you have a sentence here you wrote, yet Washington would hardly recognize the role of the presidency plays in American life today. What's had the biggest impact on change of the way people get elected president?
Yeah, I talk about two things. In the Founders chapter, I say that the Founders had this vision of enlightened leaders ruling over an educated populace. And I don't think they recognized kind of how raucous democracy could be and how open it could be, and they wouldn't necessarily always have those educated population following them. And the second thing is just technology, whether it's broadcast technology or the ability to capture people on film and moving images, or the ability for presidents to convey their image to the American people. I think all of those have really changed the way that presidents communicate with the people. You have to appeal to the common man, and that was the 19th century development that I talk about. But then in the 20th century, you have to master these various technologies in order to find ways to appeal to that common man.
Out of nowhere recently, Arsenio Hall comes back with a program. Here's a clip, the loudest clip we have, back from 1992 in June when Bill Clinton was running for the presidency. What impact did this moment have?
Well, that was indeed your loudest clip, and it was really a groundbreaking moment when Clinton goes on the Arsenio Hall show and not only plays the saxophone, but wears sunglasses and is trying to be hip. He's playing Elvis, Heartbreak Hotel. Some of the critics said not very well, but you could figure out what the song was. And then he goes and he sits down and talks to Arsenio for a good 20 minutes to a half hour about some very personal topics. And if you think back, in 1968, Richard Nixon, went on Laugh-In, and he said the signature phrase of that show, which was "Talk it to me," and he didn't say it that well, but that was it. That was the extent of his appearance, and that supposedly humanized Nixon. Here, about 20 plus years later, you've got a presidential candidate who's really putting himself out there, trying to show he's hip, trying to show he's cool, combining both music and television in a way that he's trying to appeal to the American people. And just think about it, Elvis had been kind of controversial when Elvis started. Remember, on the Ed Sullivan Show, they had to censor the gyrations of his hips when he appeared. And now it was more of a universal way to appeal to the American people by using an Elvis song in 1992. So it was really a groundbreaking moment, and in many ways Obama has followed in Clinton's footsteps. Can you think of a moment in presidential campaign history that didn't work for a candidate? Dukakis in the tank. Certainly there have been a lot of examples of that. George H.W. Bush with the scanner incident in Houston, where he appeared not to know what a scanner was. I think that story was a little overplayed by the New York Times, but nevertheless that cultural meme got out there. And I think that presidents have to be careful. You put yourself out there in a cultural environment, it doesn't always work. So Obama did so many shows in the fall. So there were over 24 shows where he appeared, to kind of entertainment shows, not hard news shows. And you can make a gaffe or two and get over it when you do that many. I mean, there was one time when David Letterman asked him the size of the deficit or the debt, and he professed not to know it. Of course he knows the size of the debt, but he didn't want to say it in that venue. But for the most part, he did pretty well with it. But it doesn't always work. You have to know what you're talking about. Ronald Reagan in 1984 talked about Bruce Springsteen and Born in the USA, and that kind of became an anthem for his campaign. Well, there were two problems with that. One is Reagan didn't really know that much Springsteen. In fact, a press aide was asked what other Springsteen songs he likes, and the press aide had no idea what other Springsteen songs Reagan liked. There probably weren't any. And second, Springsteen objected to the use of the song, and so that led to some criticism. Now, obviously, Reagan was successful and won that campaign, but that was a bit of a misstep. In the back, in your appendix, you have rules for presidents engaging pop culture, and you start off with the number one on the list is Borston's Law.
and it reads, "Our national politics has become a competition for images or between images. Presidents must therefore understand popular culture even if they don't endorse it." Daniel Boorstin gets a lot of quotes in the book. Who was he, and how did you invent Boorstin's Law?
I love Daniel Boorstin. You asked about books that were important in shaping me. I read him a little later in graduate school, but his thinking was very influential. He was a great historian. He really covered the gamut of American history and how we developed over time, both technologically and politically. And he unfortunately has passed away, but he talks in the book about the impact of television, and he talks about how you can be here, meaning you're watching at home, while you're also there being projected to the American audience, and how TV brings people into your living rooms in a way that no technology had ever done so, not even radio, which brought the voice in but not your image. And so Boorstin understood that the images that presidents project through pop culture were very important to the understanding of how Americans would perceive them.
Number 2 is Mark Knoller's Vacation Tally Law. Mark Knoller of CBS Radio. What's that?
Well, Mark Knoller, he tallies everything about the presidency, and he's got this great database, and he archives how many vacations they took and how many golf games they played and how many press conferences. And so whenever there's a presidential press conference or event, reporters go to him and say, "Oh, Mark, what's the number on this particular thing that the president's doing?" But what I found is that presidents take vacations, and I don't begrudge them their vacations, but what you find is that when a Democratic president takes vacation, they get criticized by Republicans, and when a Republican president takes vacation, they get criticized by Democrats. So I think there's a little bit of hypocrisy in the type of criticism you get. I think presidents should be allowed to have their vacations. As long as they're doing the job, that's fine. Vacations are part of life, and you need to get away. And even if you are getting away, these days with modern technology, you're always in contact.
I'm going to jump to number 5, the law of HBO and Showtime.
Yeah, well, I mentioned this a little bit earlier with the shows of the 1%. These shows get a lot of buzz, shows like The Wire and Homeland. A lot of the cultural elites talk about them. But if you refer to yourself watching them, it's not always going to be a successful tactic, because while these shows get a lot of buzz and a lot of ink, they're not necessarily watched by that many Americans.
Newton Minow had a speech back in the early 60s about the vast wasteland, meaning television. You have here in your second corollary, it says, "Be indirect, not ham-fisted. If you don't like the message of the Dark Knight, praise Catwoman." But then, what's Minow's law?
Well, Newton Minow talked about the vast wasteland. He was the FCC commissioner under Kennedy. And interestingly, when Gilligan's Island came around, the name of the ship on Gilligan's Island was the USS Minnow, which was a bit of a shot at Newton Minow. And he criticized TV as kind of being a dump of lowbrow shows and very unimpressive fare. And you can really never go wrong by trying to appear to be more highbrow than TV. And so that's what I'm trying to get at. You can't really be seen to be embracing some of the lowest brow elements of TV and try and be an effective governing leader at the same time.
A corollary you have in here, genuine praise will not be graciously received, and you only have one under that group. The left coast is not America law.
Well, the point there is that's more if you're a Republican. So if a Republican praises, let's say, Modern Family, as Mitt Romney and Mrs. Romney did, they can get criticized for their lack of support for gay marriage, which is what happened. Whereas when Obama says we love them some Modern Family, they not only are praised by the Modern Family creators, but they're also feted at a fundraiser. So I think Republicans have a little bit of a disadvantage in dealing with the culture, and I think what I'm trying to get at with that law is that they need to be cognizant of that disadvantage and make sure that if you're going to go out and praise some show, that you're not going to get slapped back by the purveyors of that show.
Who wrote the title of your book, What Jefferson Read, Ike Watched, and Obama Tweeted?
Well, I actually mentioned in the acknowledgments that I had a whole bunch of friends who strategized with me over what the title was. My original conception for a title was From Cicero to Snooki, How Our Culture Shaped Our Presidents. And the publisher, which is Regnery, rightly said that there were two problems with that. One is that the Venn diagram of people who know Snooki is and people who know Cicero is doesn't intersect. And I think they're right about that. The second is, this was in about 2011 when I was talking about writing the book, that people might not know who Snooki is in a few years, and that's pretty much true now. I think Snooki's moment, her star, has faded. So we had to come up with an alternative title, and we wanted to convey this notion, two notions. One is that we're covering the gamut of presidents all the way back. I start with Washington, but I mentioned Jefferson because he was such a big reader, all the way through Obama. So that was one thing I had to convey. The second thing is the way that culture has changed things. So they were initially reading, then they were watching, now they're tweeting. So it's both a technological shift, but also a shift in how they are portrayed. Reading is a somewhat passive act. You are reading the book that's in front of you and you don't change the text. TV is something you're watching, but you can also impact it by appearing on TV. And then tweeting, you're the president, you're actually providing content. And Obama has 30 million Twitter followers. And when he sends tweets from his account that he directly writes, he puts a BO at the end. So you know that's an actual Barack Obama written tweet.
The title of the book again is What Jefferson Read, Ike Watched, and Obama Tweeted. 200 Years of Popular Culture in the White House. Our guest has been Tevi Troy. Thank you very much.
Thanks for having me.
For free transcripts or to give us your comments about this program, visit us at Q&A.org. Q&A programs are also available as C-SPAN podcasts.
Tonight on C-SPAN, British